Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today, boy, do we have a race to recap. We will be going through the British Grand Prix, which takes place at one of my favorite tracks, Silverstone. And this race weekend was full of wet weather, bad conditions, upgrades, history, streaks being broken in both the positive and negative ways, and of course, controversial penalties. There is so much to go through this race episode, but I do feel before we go through our normal kind of standard stuff and start at the beginning of the weekend and go all the way through the end, we have to just take a moment for Nico Hulkenberg. This was his very first podium in the entirety of his Formula One career, and it was a stunning move from P19 all the way to P3. We will get into the particulars of his race, the race story itself, and of course what this actually means for Stake Sauber moving forward, and we'll do that in our normal order as we go through the race weekend and recap the entire race. But I really just wanted to take a moment at the top and just celebrate our driver of the day, Nico Hulkenberg, because this was such a stunning race for him, and I really do feel like it got overshadowed by everything else that was going on this weekend. And so before we dive into all of the drama, all of the different things that do matter across the board, this podium really deserved to open our episode. All of that being said, we are going to go through our race weekend the same way that we always do. We'll start with the basics, going into the race weekend, storylines that were important to know. Then we'll go through everything that happened before the race, so free practice sessions that were notable and qualifying. And then of course we will recap the race itself, and we'll close out on your questions that you sent in from the race, as well as your hot takes and predictions. This is just a friendly reminder that if you want to send in your questions for next week's episode, there are a bunch of ways to do that, but the best way to do it is to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube and leave those questions in the comments, or to follow me on Instagram at Marissa Kumari, because after every race, that is where I will ask for your questions, hot takes, and predictions. And lastly, another great place to do this is to join our Discord server. On the Discord server, we watch the race together, and then after the race, I'll ask for your questions and predictions to include in the episode. The links to all of that is in the episode description, so make sure you don't miss out on getting to send your questions in for next week's episode. With that, let's jump right into the things that were going on before we actually got on track. It feels like the biggest storyline that came out of this race weekend was absolutely the beginning of silly season really taking off in earnest. The biggest conversation that we had going into media day was this report that Max Verstappen is talking to Mercedes. And while this conversation was really sparked by a rumor started by Sky Sports Italy, which it is important to note is not actually Sky Sports Britain, which we're used to looking at as a credible source of information, but a separate entity that has the same name. That being said, this report was not verified, but it did come off of a point that George Russell really was the one to start. George Russell's contract is over at the end of this season, meaning that he does not have a contract to renew with Mercedes for next season or beyond that. And notably, while we know he is talking to Mercedes about continuing, we have not seen him finalize that contract, and we've also seen both him and Toto Wolff acknowledge that they have not finalized or signed a contract to renew. And given that George has had a pretty solid season so far, including race wins, it has been a good question as to why this isn't going on. What is it that Mercedes is looking for from George that would renew this contract? And we saw George continue to be asked about this prior to this weekend. And in this conversation, one of the things he said was that Formula One is still a business, and so of course there are conversations still happening with the likes of Max Verstappen. This obviously sparks a huge conversation about the fact that Max Verstappen and Toto Wolff may be talking. Toto is asked about this and also kind of confirms that yes, he would of course be interested in having Max move to Mercedes. This is not the first time we've had rumors about Max going to Mercedes. We had them last season as well, and things just objectively explode after this tweet from Sky Sports Italy. And as we get into the weekend, these are of course the biggest conversations happening at media day. Max is asked about it and does not deny it, but does say that he doesn't want to talk about it, has no further comment, and won't comment on whether or not he would ever like to drive for another team. He does bring up the fact that he's previously said he would like to finish his career with Red Bull, would love to stay with one team the whole way through, and essentially doesn't deny but will not speak on this. Max does have a contract through 2028 with Red Bull, but there is rumored to be, and slightly confirmed by Christian Horner previously, an exit clause that has to do with performance. We don't know what the particulars are of that performance clause, but we do know that Red Bull has not been performing in the way that Max would like, and while he currently sits third in the driver's standings, George Russell is actually not too far behind him. Max has 165 points and sits in third, and George has 147 in fourth. And we continue to see Max complain about the car week after week, and on top of that, no matter who seems to be in that second seat, we have not seen any performance from that second Red Bull either. And so if there is a performance clause, it's possible that it's getting close to being something that Max could act on. And while we don't know if there are any real teeth to these rumors, if Max really might be considering going over to Mercedes and leaving Red Bull, I think one of the more interesting conversations that came out of this was George kind of asserting that he would be the one to stay at Red Bull over Kimi Antonelli should Max actually move over. This was something that he really asserted this week during media, because when he pointed out previously that part of what was delaying his contract negotiations was the idea that Max might be in conversation with Mercedes or other drivers, the assumption that came out of that was that Max would be replacing George. George then comes into media this week and really asserts that he's the driver who's been performing better, and as long as he continues to focus on his performance, even if Max comes over, there are two seats. One of the things that he says actually is that he doesn't see himself leaving Mercedes Mercedes anytime soon, and that whoever his teammate is, he's not worried, sort of asserting that he's locked in and that the other seat is between Kimi Antonelli and Max Verstappen. And I thought this was interesting because this really comes down to an idea of whether performance or future potential is more important to a team. If you're looking at a teammate head-to-head and you're deciding which driver is more valuable to the team right now in this moment, George is, of course, outperforming his rookie teammate Kimi Antonelli. George is sitting fourth in the driver's standings. He's won a race this year. He's had 1 pole position and 5 podiums. And if you expand to look at his entire F1 career, he's had 4 race wins, 20 podiums, and 7 pole positions. So arguably, yes, if we're just looking at performance and you're picking between the two drivers, George is outperforming Kimi. But then you have to also look at this idea of potential, because Kimi is a driver that is only 18 years old, and this was his 12th Grand Prix. And in those 12 Grand Prix, he has become the youngest pole sitter in history after taking the sprint pole in Miami, and has already gotten his first career podium, making him the 3rd youngest driver to do so. Kimi is a driver who we know has incredible raw speed, and the learning curve at 18 years old with very little experience really shows that he has this untapped potential that we're going to see flourish here in Formula One. And there's not only the conversation of how far he may go and whether or not that ceiling is higher than George's, but also the amount of effort that was put into getting Kimi into this seat. This was a very large risk and perceived as one, putting an 18-year-old not only in a Formula One seat, but in a Formula One seat at a top team with a very powerful car fighting at the front of the grid. This was a decision that we know had a lot of friction while Toto was trying to push it through, a decision that we know meant that they went with an 18-year-old unproven over other experienced drivers that were available, and a decision that was highly criticized. Was this too soon? Did this driver really have the potential that they thought he did? And was this a risk financially, not only in the way that we could see him crash the car or be an issue there, but also in the face of the brand and sponsors and how many of them would want to stay with an 18-year-old versus the 40-year-old that they had before? Mercedes is a legacy brand, and this was a conversation of whether or not Kimi was really good enough to justify this change in branding. And so I think when you look at these two drivers, if Toto Wolff and Mercedes are in a situation where they actually have to decide between George or Kimi moving forward, while George has been a part of the team for a very long time, and their relationship even started with George bringing a PowerPoint presentation to Toto and trying to show why they should sponsor him moving forward. He was a Mercedes junior who went to Williams. He's waited his turn and got up to Mercedes. He's a race winner and everything else. It's hard to say that you choose a driver whose potential is clear and that you know where their ceiling kind of sits over a driver that you believe is not only young and has a long future, but as we've seen Toto and the rest of the team talk about him as a driver that they believe will be one of the greats ultimately. And again, it's all rumors and silly season, but a thought exercise for you. You've got Max Verstappen, George Russell, and Kimi Antonelli. Who do you choose as your driver lineup? A driver who is a current great that's already got 4 championships and really has proven he can do a lot with a car regardless of how good it is. A driver who has been loyal to your team and has a lot of success, but not necessarily a great amount of success, and whose potential you probably can see down the line to the top of it, or an 18-year-old who seems to have pretty much any future ahead of him that will continue to maintain your brand for longer, far after the other 2 drivers who are available retire. This is sort of a horrible decision to have to make, but also the best of 3 worlds, I suppose. None of the decisions are necessarily wrong or bad. All of the decisions are stressful and mean that someone gets their feelings hurt. But again, as George himself actually said this week, Formula One is a business, and that means that they have decisions that they have to make that are not only the best for themselves, but for the team as a whole and the business of the team. And it's hard to say which of these 3 becomes the most important, but it's kind of hard to believe that Mercedes would want to throw away all of the work and effort that they did getting Kimi into the seat to begin with, to toss him out of Formula One just as quickly. As far as all of this goes, though, it's hard to say when we're going to see George actually sign a contract, whether he'll start talking to other teams, and whether that will be public, and if or when we will know whether or not Max is staying with Red Bull or moving on, and whether that place would be Mercedes. I expect it to be the biggest part of silly season, something that we'll keep talking about, and something that I think would have sounded so outrageous that we wouldn't even be talking about it before we saw Lewis Hamilton move to Ferrari last year. I think once that happened, everything else has just sounded like, oh, this is so ridiculous, this is so impossible. And then you're like, yeah, but wasn't it ridiculous and impossible that Lewis Hamilton would go to Ferrari? That Lewis Hamilton wouldn't finish his career with Mercedes? I truly feel like any rumor could be possible. You could tell me that there are aliens and they're going to be driving for Formula One next year, and I'd be like, yeah, sounds right. Welcome to the grid, Martians. And speaking of Lewis Hamilton, the other big storyline heading into this race was Lewis Hamilton's historic relationship with this track and the amount of success he's had here, and whether or not that success would continue this week. This part is going to be a little bit of a bummer to go through if you already know how the race ended, but we're going to go through it anyway because it is important to the history of this track, the history of this race, and why this race was so important to Lewis. Lewis Hamilton won last year here at Silverstone, and that marked his 9th British Grand Prix win. That meant that he officially broke the record for most Grand Prix wins at a single circuit with a total of 9. And prior to that, he had been tied tied with Michael Schumacher. Lewis Hamilton won his first British Grand Prix in 2008, then every year from 2014 to 2017, and then every year again from 2019 to 2021, and then again for the 9th time last year in 2024. And on top of all of that, he had finished on the podium every single year since 2014 when the hybrid era started. That had actually been 12 consecutive podiums at Silverstone if you include the 70th anniversary Grand Prix that Silverstone held back in 2020. In the past, he has had 7 pole positions here, 5 fastest laps, and led 357 laps at this circuit. He also has such a good relationship with this track that he has a portion of the track named after him. The Hamilton Straight is right by the start-finish line and was named after him in 2020. It was actually the very first portion of the Silverstone circuit to be named after a driver. And so one of the biggest conversations we had going into this race, especially given the performance that we saw from the Ferrari's last race and the improvements that we've been seeing from them, was would Lewis be able to continue this streak? Would he be able to have a 13th consecutive podium and continue the fact that he has finished on the podium every year since the hybrid era began? Obviously, we know that unfortunately he didn't, and so that's why it's a little difficult to recount all of this history, but it is important to understand what the reasoning was behind the pressure and why this race meant so much to him. Of course, also last year when he won this race, it was a very emotional one because he was ending an almost 1,000-day loss streak, the longest he had ever gone without winning a race in Formula One. This was coming amid so much conversation about whether or not Ferrari had made a mistake signing him, whether or not he really still had the ability to drive in this sport, and again, a conversation that unfortunately we're still having. And so I think that coming into this race, this was so important to him, and some of this history is why you heard so much conversation going on about it, because this was also a chance for his first podium with Ferrari at his home race at a race that matters so much to him. Other things that I will say that were not race relevant, but relevant to me, was that Lewis Hamilton's dog was back in the paddock. If you've not seen the photos and videos of this dog, you really need to go on the internet and look at it, because there are videos of both of the Ferrari dogs meeting and hanging out with each other, and there are also photos of Kimi Antonelli meeting Lewis Hamilton's dog. And I just feel like if you need a little bit of joy, this is a perfect place to find it. Also, again, not race related, but paddock guest related. Percy Pig was in the paddock this weekend, and there were some hilarious photos of him and Ollie Behrman, which again, for a little bit of joy, I recommend looking at. So that kind of wraps up a lot of the big news going into the race weekend. Let's talk about free practice and qualifying. I will say there were some moments where in free practice sessions, especially FP1 and FP2, it felt like Lewis Hamilton was going to continue the streak and that the Ferraris were really in a good way. And the other big thing that we were going to contend with, had this been a dry race, was that Pirelli actually changed the tire compounds that were utilized for Silverstone this year compared to the year previous. If you're not really familiar with how the tires work, obviously when you listen to a race, you're hearing about soft, medium, and hard tires, and the fact that they have to come in and change to have a different compound and the different ways that those compounds work. But in case you don't know the full extent of how this works, or if you're a little bit newer to the sport, Pirelli is the official tire provider for Formula One, and they actually developed a range of different tire compounds that they were providing this year. Even though we typically only hear about a soft, medium, and hard, there are actually 6 different compounds that Pirelli utilizes, and they designate 3 of them for each race. Those range from a C1 to a C6, and this year we actually saw them go a step softer than we typically see them go at Silverstone. This was meant to encourage a 2-stop race. Previously, we've seen them go with a slightly harder compound range, which allows for a 1-stop race, and the idea behind changing it to a little bit softer is the fact that the Silverstone track is pretty tough on tires. And so if we go a step softer, it's more likely that more teams will need to take a second pit stop, which gives us more excitement and more possibilities for a little bit of a strategy change or moves. And when we thought we were going to have a dry race this weekend, I was pretty interested to see how that would affect this race. Whether we were going to have to see more drivers take that second pit stop, and also whether or not that was going to change the ultimate version of the race we were expecting. But ultimately, none of that really matters because the race is so wet and we spend so much of this race on inters. And the pit stop strategy was completely different because of that weather. And so even though we're seeing all of this performance from free practice and feeling like, okay, we've got a better performance from the Ferraris, the McLarens are still looking pretty solid, Arvid Lindblad gets his FP1 debut, Max is still complaining about the performance of the car, all of the free practice moments that we get that might indicate where we're going for the race sort of get thrown out of the window because of the rain. The last thing that was important to know from free practice was that Ollie Behrman ends up getting a 10-place grid penalty for a red flag infringement. Not only does he get that 10 grid penalty, but he also gets 4 points on his super license, which was sort of the sign, honestly, that penalties were going to be as harsh as they were for the rest of the weekend. Also going into qualifying, we know that Kimi Antonelli already has a 3-place grid penalty coming over from Austria when he crashed into Max. So off the bat, we know these 2 rookies, no matter how well they qualify, are definitely dropping down in the order. So that takes us right into qualifying. And it was quite eventful because right in Q1, Franco Colapinto spins out, takes himself out of qualifying, and red flags the session. And again, this is really an indicator of what the race is going to look like. And another Q1 result that was pretty important, we see Nico Hulkenberg end up P19. And I think as we go through, every time I talk about Nico, I'm just gonna like feel a smile coming across my face and joy for this man, because P19 to P3, we will get through the race, but my God, we actually even see Nico get out qualified by his teammate Gabriel Bortoleto, but Gabby's not much further ahead of him in P17, and then Lance Stroll and Liam Lawson round out your other Q1 exits. Disappointing weekend for Liam directly after such a great weekend for him in Austria, and we just don't see that carry over for him this weekend. Notably, you have both of your Williams out in Q2 with both Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon knocked out, but you do have both of them moving ahead after those grid penalties are applied, and also Carlos does out-qualify Alex this weekend. And I think for Williams also, despite the fact that they had this Q2 exit, they just wanted to get both cars on track all the way around the track until the end of the race. It has been 3 DNFs in a row for Alex Albon, and I think any positive momentum forward was really important for them, and even just getting out of Q3 into Q2, it was a positive, I think. You also have Esteban Ocon knocked out here and out-qualified by Ollie Behrman, though obviously once those penalties are applied, he ends up starting behind him, and your other 2 Q2 exits are Yuki Tsunoda and Isaac Hadjar, with Yuki again failing to make it to Q1 and really just spotlighting where Red Bull sits right now. And then I would also say on the Lewis Hamilton Ferrari side, we have this amazing run in qualifying where it feels like, okay, Lewis might actually take this pole position. And for a moment, he actually is in contention. This last run of laps for the final pole position was so tight. And it really actually seemed like everybody had poor performance in that third sector. Everyone was losing time. Lewis ends up losing the time that he needs in the last 2 corners. And instead of pole, he ends up 5th overall. Charles Leclerc is actually behind him in 6th. And then in the battle for pole position, we see Max Verstappen take pole, Oscar behind him in 2nd, and Lando in 3rd. Rounding this out, we also had George Russell in 4th, and then obviously the 2 Ferraris, Lewis Hamilton in 5th and Charles Leclerc in 6th, Kimi Antonelli right behind them in 7th, again prior to his grid drop. And what was really exciting about this final run was that these final laps were so close. When you look at the gaps, it really was a very small margin between the top 5 drivers. And so as we head into the race, it sort of feels like anyone's game. And there's conversation that all 5 of your top drivers have a shot at winning this. So that takes us through everything that happened before the Grand Prix and qualifying. Let's get into the race itself. So right from the start of this race, we already run into issues when it comes to tires and the weather. While it was not actively raining at the start of this race, we were dealing with a wet track. And so we see everyone line up on the grid with inters on. All 20 cars are fitted with inters as we head into the formation lap. But as we're driving around, we start to see drivers kind of look at this and say the track may be too dry for inters and we're going to need to come in quickly. And so we do see some drivers take this risk and go into the pit lane for a tire change before the race itself starts. You can do this after the formation lap, which is what they did, but then that means you lose track position. You're not starting from where you qualified on the grid, you lose that track position. But we saw a number of drivers take this risk, basically saying we feel like if we lose track position, it's worth it for the advantage that we're going to get from the tires, because essentially these drivers and their strategy teams are saying we think everyone else is going to have to come in and change from inters to slicks, and if we do that now, ultimately we come out ahead. And this would be a calculated risk if the track itself is dry enough to support being on slicks. But as we end up seeing, this does not end up being an advantage at all. From the front of the field, we see George Russell and Charles Leclerc take this big risk, go in for slicks, and we also see Isaac Hadjar, Gabriel Bortoleto, and Ollie Behrman do the same. And so as we get away with the start on the grid, things will look a little bit different. And so those drivers who are on slicks essentially make the wrong decision. The biggest thing that we hear drivers report is that while some of the track is pretty dry, it's a little too wet in that final sector to be safe to switch to slicks. And by lap 2, we already have yellow flags out and we have Franco Colapinto already having retired. That we have the virtual safety car deployed so that Liam Lawson's car can be recovered, and that gives people another chance to switch to slick tires, which basically means everyone who tried to take kind of that hero run of having this advantage of doing it during the formation lap would have been able to take that gamble here without having lost track position. We even see Kimi Antonelli go in for slick tires and come out ahead of George Russell, his teammate who had started with that formation lap risk. And so essentially we see that nothing is really gained by doing this, and also that the track was not dry enough for these slick tires. And I think this in particular was just a tough strategy call because the weather itself was so unpredictable. We end up seeing that they're starting to report rain very quickly into the race, meaning that also this was kind of a tough decision because with the track being as dry as it was possible that they were going to need slicks really quickly and that they were going to run through these inters so fast. Intermediate tires are not made for a dry track, they're made for a wet track. And so in the formation lap, if we're reporting that most of the track is dry, it makes sense for them to say, okay, let's see if we can take a gamble and make a quick move. And we assume that everybody else is going to have to make this same move. But the main trouble is just that the track was not dry enough and that we continued to see a number of issues. Almost as soon as we have the virtual safety car back in, Gabriel Bortoleto is in the gravel and retires as well. And as we go through the front of this race, so much of the race story comes down to the fact that we just did not have a lot of racing laps at the beginning of this race. In the small amount of time that we actually are racing, Oscar does manage to take the lead and start to build a gap. But as more and more drivers are crashing and retiring, we continue to see more safety cars have to come out. And ultimately that neutralizes Oscar's lead. And as the conditions of this race continue, we just have so many safety cars come out, and Oscar's lead that he does get is effectively neutralized by the weather, the safety cars, and these cars that are continually spinning off of track. At one point, we literally have Isaac Hadjar crash into the back of Kimi Antonelli because he can't see. And I think at this point, we'll get the elephant out of the way and we'll talk about this Piastri penalty. Because at lap 22, we see the safety car ending, and that is where we end up with this 10-second penalty for Oscar. I've seen a lot of people comparing this to George Russell's incident in Canada, saying that we essentially established that this was not a penalty and that if George didn't get a penalty, Oscar shouldn't. And I do think it's important to point out a couple of things that are very different about these situations. Just for a small refresher on what happened in Canada, George Russell was leading the race and Max Verstappen was behind him in second. And there was a safety car ending this race, meaning that at this point we knew that the race was ending under safety car. We weren't going to have a safety car restart. Ending under safety car means that the positions that are already on track stay the same. So at that point, George Russell was going to finish first, Max was going to finish second. And as we may remember, Max and George have had a little bit of tension going back and forth, and especially going into that race, there were a couple of comments made by George, and he and Max have gone back and forth even before this season. But in the situation in Canada, with a few laps left to go, George hits his brakes under a safety car in a manner that we see Max actually pass him under the safety car for an overtake, and then he has to hand that back. Almost immediately, we see them get on the radio, say that the other person was at fault, and essentially trying to push the idea of a penalty for either one of them. And significantly after the race, we see Red Bull lodge a protest, which ultimately the FIA ends up ruling that nobody was at fault, no penalties will be awarded, and the podium stays exactly how it was before. Now, the thing that I think is important to point out that I think a lot of people are forgetting is that one, the actual complaint that was lodged was about unsportsmanlike conduct. The FIA just also included a lot of the telemetry in their ruling. But the unsportsmanlike conduct was this idea that George was trying to get Max a penalty, and that his behavior over the radio was unsportsmanlike and deserved to be penalized. So let's get into the different circumstances of Oscar in this situation. One, this was not a race that was at the end of the race and ending under a safety car. This was a safety car restart. When we're in a safety car restart, the driver at the front controls the pace of said restart. But the difference here for Oscar specifically is that when this braking incident happens, the lights had gone out for that restart, which means that we were already under the conditions that he would be restarting the race. The other big difference is the intensity with which Oscar hits those brakes. When we look at what happened with George, we know that he applied pressure to his brakes of 30 psi, which the FIA ultimately ruled was similar to the way that he had been applying pressure throughout the race under the safety car in this part of the track on laps prior, which means that they were able to say that we didn't feel that this was erratic or extreme because he had essentially already been doing this. On the flip side, when we look at Oscar's pressure here, he's at almost double at 59.2 psi. Now, you're going to see a lot of people talking about the brake pressure and the amount that's put here, and I do think that there is some nuance when it comes to the track conditions, the speed at which they're going, and why he would have put that much pressure. But nevertheless, the bigger issue that you can kind of compare these things to make them not exactly apples to apples, but apples to sort of relevantly close fruit would be the speed at which he decelerated and how severe it was. Oscar hits those brakes with about double the amount of pressure as George does in Canada, which means that he actually decelerates from 218 kilometers per hour down to 52 kilometers per hour. So your big two differences here, if we're keeping track, the point at which the race was happening and also the fact that we were not ending the race under a safety car, but under a safety car restart here, and the amount of pressure and suddenness of this deceleration. If you're not familiar with kilometers to miles, this is a pretty intense, almost 100-mile-an-hour deceleration here. And then you also have the weather conditions here. This is a pretty big difference to what we were dealing with in Canada, because at this point, we've already had a number of incidents, cars hitting each other, cars having to retire, cars spinning. The visibility of the track at this point was very, very bad. And the speed at which this happened was ultimately ruled dangerous because the FIA said that Max had to take avoiding action to make sure that he did not crash into Oscar. And had he actually crashed into Oscar, had he not been able to see, had he not taken that avoiding action, the argument here is that he would have crashed into Oscar going about the same speed that Oscar was going before he suddenly slowed down. And the other big thing here also that we learn after the race is that this doesn't just affect Oscar and Max here. This actually caused a chain reaction throughout the grid, which luckily everyone was able to avoid, but it did affect the rest of the grid. And with these conditions, it did cause a dangerous situation where drivers could have been hurt. Because of all of that, we do see a penalty awarded here. And I do think, honestly, while this is not the argument that Oscar is necessarily looking at or feeling, I do think that this should have been a penalty, and I do think that it was a dangerous situation. And I think the argument is really not necessarily whether or not the penalty should have been awarded, but whether or not it was too harsh. The options for this penalty would have been either 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And obviously they went for the harsher penalty at 10 seconds. Their argument here could be a number of things. One, it was very dangerous and could have caused a larger accident, and therefore they wanted to be harsher. Two, it did cause a chain reaction and could have caused harm to the rest of the grid, not just the person directly behind him. And three, this could have been a deterrent for other drivers or Oscar himself to continue making these kinds of moves in races. Because I will be honest with you, it's very unlikely that he'll do this exact thing again. And so I think an argument here, and maybe a fair frustration, especially if you're Oscar, is that, okay, fine, this could have been a penalty, but it shouldn't have been a full 10-second penalty. 5 seconds would have been harsh enough, and this is something that we can kind of work forward and make sure we don't do again. On that end, I'm not sure where I sit, whether it should have been 10 seconds or 5 seconds. Obviously, not being in the room with the FIA when this happens makes it a little difficult to know exactly what scenarios they were looking at and why they felt that this needed to be a larger penalty rather than a softer one. But I do think the penalty should have happened. And I'm curious, I do think it's fair to say it could have been 5 seconds, it could have been 10. I'm curious how people feel about this because I do think that there has been a lot of bias in the conversation just based off of which driver you like better. Even with Julian Palmer, for example, in the F1 TV after show, we even heard him saying all of the reasons this should have been a penalty and even really understanding why this was called, but then basically kind of undoing a lot of that logic with his own emotions and his empathy, having been a driver kind of in these situations before and knowing how you feel about a penalty and how it may affect you. And so I think it's kind of hard because if you look at the numbers and you look at the facts and you try to take your bias out of it, whether you like Oscar, you like Lando better, whether you're hoping for Oscar to win or you don't want him to win the WDC, whether you really like Max, whether you really like George and you feel like this was unfair, I think there are so many different angles that you can come at it from. And I think that because of that, so much of this conversation is becoming more about like character than the numbers. And I think if you just look at the numbers, it was a penalty. It should have been called. And we constantly criticize the FIA for not calling penalties that they should. And I think when the penalties are dangerous situations, they should be called. I think there's obviously a conversation about whether or not it's too harsh, whether it should have been 5 seconds or 10 seconds. I just don't know that this should have turned into a conversation about Oscar deserving to win this race when this was a mistake. It was a mistake that was penalized and it kind of moves forward. And obviously it's a harsh penalty and it's hard to deal with. It's a hard pill to swallow, but by the rule book, it should have been penalized. I also think when we're talking about the harshness of this penalty, we're seeing a lot of conversation about British bias, about certain drivers being penalized more than others. But I also think it's important to look at some of the penalties that we saw this weekend and recognize that the entire weekend, the FIA has been very harsh. Ollie Behrman, who is a British driver, received a 10 grid penalty for something that happened in FP3, along with 4 points on his license. Yuki Tsunoda also received a 10-second time penalty this race. There were a number of people that were affected by the FIA's calls being so harsh this week. And I think a lot of times when we look back, when the racing conditions are more dangerous, we also see that the penalties are harsher. And so yes, this does essentially change Oscar's race. It does also cause problems with the conditions of the race, given that Oscar can't really take a pit stop and serve this penalty early, because getting off those inters, knowing that they'll eventually all need to go to slick tires, would have basically had him do an extra pit stop just to serve that penalty early. And if you listen to Zach Brown himself talk about this later, and this was again post-race on F1 TV, we see him say that at a certain point there was this possibility that they would have been able to get Oscar back with a safety car again, which again would not have been a shocking thing to have happened, given that at the point that this penalty was given, we had spent, I feel like, more laps under safety car than we had racing. So there were possibilities that Oscar could have had some good luck and things could have gone his way again, but that's not what we see. I also think we see some more drama surrounding this because Max obviously spins out right after this. So after the race, we see other drivers say that yes, they did see the effects of this braking incident at the beginning, and then also right after this incident happens when Max is complaining and potentially in kind of a bad headspace from this avoiding incident, we see him spin out and drop an extreme number of positions. And at that point, Max was really out of the race. So was the penalty too harsh? It's kind of up to your own personal feelings on this, and I think that people aren't necessarily going to be swayed one way or the other. I think the discourse surrounding this, and I think people can get just as emotional as the drivers on track get emotional by these types of things, and I think that's part of being a fan of things. I think that's totally normal to get upset and kind of feel the way you want to feel when it comes to your driver that you're proud of. I do think there's this energy of there is no one wanting to be reasoned with about it, and so I think for yourself, you're just going to have to decide, was this penalty too harsh? Should it have been 5 seconds? Was 10 seconds acceptable? But try to understand the reasoning behind this situation in Canada and the differences there and why this was called as a penalty. Because at the very least, I think that's worth recognizing. And after the restart is when things start to feel pretty chaotic. After this whole incident, the grid is definitely shaken up, and Lance Stroll is in P3 with Nico Hulkenberg in P4, and Gasly is P5 with Lewis Hamilton in P6. Before we move on from talking about the McLaren drivers, I almost just want to finish up with them because a lot of the rest of the race, I think, is getting negated in this conversation about the penalty, whether it was fair or not. And there was a lot of really fun racing and really exciting moments for the rest of the grid. So I kind of want to get the Lando Oscar of it all out of the way so that we can focus on some of the other big moments here. A couple of other things that I do think are relevant to point out, Lando ran a clean race and was able to do so under these wet conditions. And one of the things that I haven't really agreed with about this penalty is this idea that Lando was handed the race based on this penalty. I do think that it did kind of rob us of seeing what would have happened between these two drivers, but if the penalty hadn't happened, it doesn't necessarily mean that Lando wouldn't have caught up and that we wouldn't have necessarily seen a little bit of a battle on track between the two of them. Once that 10-second penalty was in play, we knew that we were not going to see Lando have to really make big moves, and also that we weren't going to see Lando try to take any risky moves to pass Oscar, given that we were in pretty rough conditions, and he knew that he had the 10-second penalty coming in so that he was able to calculate based off of that. Once that 10-second penalty is called, there's really no reason for Lando to get up to the back of Oscar or make any sort of risky moves that might push one of them off track, or any possible move that could have ended with either of them not finishing this race. And so because that penalty was awarded, it does keep us from knowing what that would have looked like. But it is relevant to point out that before Oscar even went in and served that penalty, they had built such an insane gap to the rest of the grid. Both drivers were driving good races, and at a certain point, even with that 10-second penalty in mind, there was a conversation about what they would do if Lando did get within DRS, meaning that we were seeing both of them move pretty quickly, and that if this penalty had not happened, we may still have seen a fight on track, we may still have seen Lando win this race. And even if Oscar had only been given a 5-second penalty, it is likely that Lando would have still won because the gap was a little over 7 seconds. And the other thing that's relevant to talk about here is Oscar's radio message asking to swap the cars. We know that afterwards he said that he definitely never thought it was going to happen, but he just had to ask. And I think the radio message may have been blown up a little bit, even though I thought it was a little outlandish to ask. A lot of people seem to feel like every driver would have asked in this scenario for this. We basically, at the end of the race, see Oscar radio the team and say, "I thought the penalty earlier was pretty harsh. If you also thought the penalty was too harsh, let us swap positions and then race for the win." And with that, obviously this was never going to happen. I think asking for your teammate to be penalized, whether or not you feel the penalty that you received was unfair, given the fact that your teammate is not at all involved in that penalty, makes it clear that this is not going to be something that the team would agree to do. I guess you can't necessarily fault him for asking, especially in this feeling that he seems to have had that he was robbed of this win. But I do think the bigger takeaway from this, from Oscar's reaction overall, is the fact that we can no longer hear commentary about him being cool, calm, collected, and unemotional. For the rest of the race over the radio, after the race on the radio, the way he behaved in the actual cooldown room, and the way that he behaved on the podium and the post-race press conference, everything about that was incredibly emotional. None of it was calm, cool, or collected. And I think we're kind of seeing the way he deals with something that he feels is unfair. And I think when you look at both of the McLaren drivers, they've both had moments of weakness like this. Lando has just been, I think, more heavily criticized for it and more openly spoken about his emotions and therefore branded the emotional one. Versus I think the bigger thing with Oscar here and the way that he behaved post-race is that I think Oscar's lack of emotion, or branded as such, has been looked at as something that makes him better than Lando when it comes to championship mentality. And I think today we saw that that's just not there. There is not this constant idea of him having no emotions. I think he has lacked a lot of display of emotions. And then I think that display lacking has actually been more when things are going his way. When he's winning races, we don't see large celebrations. We see some awkwardness and things like that. And I think we've seen so many people, especially people who feel like masculinity should not come with emotion, say that Oscar's lack of emotion and calm level-headedness have made him better championship material than Lando, who expresses his emotions perhaps a little bit more openly, or maybe just in a way that I guess is not necessarily super comfortable or familiar to people. I think actually both of them, especially after today, have had these moments where the way they've expressed their emotions hasn't necessarily been the most professional, and that some of it sometimes shows how young they both are. But I think the bigger conversation is whether or not we just let these people be a little human, and whether or not we keep propping Oscar up as though his lack of emotion makes him a better championship driver than Lando. Because I think that has been, for me personally, the frustration in this conversation about emotion, this idea that not expressing your emotions is better. And honestly, the number of DMs that I've received from men calling Lando too soft to be a champion every time he says something interesting, I just think there's like a lot of weird energy surrounding this idea of emotion between both of these drivers. And I think for me, this kind of ended the conversation. Oscar is having a moment where he's feeling just as openly wounded as Lando has previously, and he's reacting to it in a way that is not necessarily the most professional or calm and level-headed. And so I think we have to stop saying that he's so much more of a champion than Lando is because he doesn't express emotions that are negative. Because clearly he does. Clearly today he had a tough time kind of getting through it. And we heard a lot of conversation from him about the idea that he deserved a different outcome today. And I think that word deserve gets sticky. And then outside of the McLaren of it all, we have a ton going on. 5 people do not finish this race. Those people are Liam Lawson, Gabriel Bortoleto, Kimi Antonelli, Isaac Adjar, and Franco Colapinto. And if you're thinking there's a pattern in those names, it's because every single rookie except Ollie Behrman does not finish this race. And while Ollie does finish outside of the points, you have to hand it to him. Making it all the way through this pretty intense race, pretty bad conditions, and a race that all of the other rookies are not able to finish, it's a pretty impressive thing to have on your resume. In terms of not ideal finishes, but steps forward, we also have Williams, where we see both Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon make it across the finish line in a way that we have not seen in weeks. And by in a way, I just mean they literally finished. They finished the whole race in one piece. Alex even manages to finish inside the points, and this is a big move forward for them. They had such a strong start to this season, and then things have just been falling completely off. And so for them to actually be able to move forward and finish the race makes it seem like we may have some progress going forward. Though with this, I do have to say, previous weeks I've been saying that the performance has not been as big of an issue, given the fact that they're so comfortably in that 5th position. But at the end of this race, we kind of have someone breathing down their necks, and that is Kick Sauber. At the end of this race, Williams has 59 points in the Constructors' Championship, and Sauber has 41, making that gap only an 18-point difference and making it a little bit less comfortable for them. But so it is important to see this performance change and to see this positive move forward, because they are going to need to continue moving forward to hold that 5th position. And even though we did not see both Alpines finish because Franco Colapinto did not finish the race, we do see a pretty impressive performance from Pierre Gasly, and he does finish 6th. And Pierre is one of the people on the grid that makes me kind of bummed, because I feel like he just had so much potential and he is such a good driver. And we see these glimmering moments where he's able to kind of pull everything together and the car wants to participate and the conditions work together. And a lot of times we see him perform very well in the rain. I think about the race last year where he and Esteban managed a podium. A lot of times we talk about rain as the great equalizer because a lot of the car performance gets neutralized here. And while this was kind of a back and forth race, it wasn't like Brazil where we were completely underwater. This was enough rain for us to see some of the drivers who are so good that are in the back perform at the front and get to see these moments where you're like, oh my God, I didn't realize that they could actually do all of this. Pierre has the experience. He is a good driver, and there are only a couple of moments where we get to see that performance from him. And I'm always kind of hopeful that one day he'll get a car that gives him a chance to really show what he can do. He obviously has this kind of deep history with Red Bull and getting pushed out of Red Bull, getting promoted and then unpromoted and then moving around and eventually finding his home at Alpine. And I think what sucks is the not knowing, seeing these types of performances from him and knowing that there was a potential for him to be in a better car and not knowing what he would have done with it always is a hard thing to swallow. Other notable moments are George Russell finishing in 10th, which is a tough watch given the fact that he's obviously in the midst of all of these contract negotiations as we've discussed, and also given the fact that this marks the first Silverstone Grand Prix in over a decade that Mercedes is not on the podium at their home race. Kimi Antonelli doesn't finish, and George Russell barely finishes in the points. This was not a good week for Mercedes. And then we should talk about the person who has a number of those podiums, which is Lewis Hamilton. I think we can talk about Ferrari as a whole as well. Charles Leclerc had maybe one of the most disappointing races that I think he's had in a long time. The performance wasn't there, but also it felt like his race was doomed from the formation lap when he went in for slicks. Everything from there just continues to be negative, continues to fall apart. He cannot get this race to come together for him, and he finishes 14th out of 15 cars that actually crossed the finish line. I think this was a tough weekend for Charles Leclerc from qualifying all the way to the end of the race, and I think we also heard Lewis kind of back him up in the post-race interviews where he did talk about the fact that any performance you're seeing from the car is really them pulling it out, and that the car in these conditions was not a comfortable car to drive. In the same way, there are moments where we think Lewis is going to get that podium. Ultimately, he finishes this race 4th, which is pretty impressive when you're looking at your teammate gap and seeing that you have 10 people in between you. But at the same time, this is just not where he wanted to be. And we also hear a couple of things after the race which are quite troubling, one of which being the fact that they actually lost GPS on Lewis's car from the pit wall. And so there were so many things that they weren't able to see, and Lewis had to kind of make decisions on his own on, and there wasn't the same amount of ability for the team to be together in the way they should have been able to be. Ultimately, Lewis does not make it onto the podium. But I will be honest with you, as I was watching through, coming into this race, I was thinking, I want to see Lewis at least hit this podium, get his first podium with Ferrari, the story of it, and the longevity of his relationship with Silverstone. I think anyone, whether you're a Lewis fan or not, can kind of root for that. But by the time we were getting towards the podium, I was sitting there and I was like, you know what? If this man takes this podium from Nico Hulkenberg, I'm going to lose my mind. I was like conflicted over and over again. And then as we got lap over lap, I was like, nope, don't touch Nico. Let him have it. And I think honestly, Lewis Hamilton finishing 4th is a step forward for him. It's a step forward for Ferrari, and it's not what they wanted, but it was a move forward. He does break all of those amazing streaks that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and that is tough to watch. Obviously emotional after the race, and we hear kind of the frustration in that and them trying to continue to figure this out. It's hard to tell though whether the car is moving forward or whether Lewis is just moving forward, because over the last 2 weeks, if we look at their performances, it's exciting to see them moving forward. We saw them doing well in Austria, and then we see Lewis perform well here, but it's hard to tell whether that's driver or car, if they figured something out, or if things are continuing to go wrong. And so we'll kind of have to wait until the next race to know that. And now we have arrived at the part of the race that we cannot let go, which is Nico Nico Hulkenberg. Your driver of the day raced from P19 and finished on the podium in a Sauber. And this was such an emotional podium for him for a number of reasons. But to put this into perspective, I think the best person who did this was DC, David Coulthard, who posted a series of things that have happened between Nico Hulkenberg entering Formula One and his first podium. Nico has been in Formula One for 15 years and 239 races entered. And this was his very first podium. Things that have happened since his debut as labeled by DC. The iPad came out, Instagram launched for the first time, Justin Bieber's Baby was released, and the Burj Khalifa opened officially. I thought this was such a funny way to put this into context, but it also really helps put it into context. Nico Hulkenberg has this incredible run of being a great driver. We know he's a good driver. And he also holds this horrible record that he broke today of the most races entered without a podium. And now he finally breaks it. And also, I was a little emotional because he broke it with his old teammate in the garage. Kevin Magnussen was sitting there rooting him on, cheering him on, and it was a beautiful win to watch them celebrate together. Another couple of things that honestly made me go, oh, this is why I love sports. This is why I love Formula One. Gabriele Bortoleto coming over the radio saying, hey, this is Gabby. I think what you did was legendary. Such a sweet moment. And then we see him running to the podium to be there to celebrate him. There are a couple of hilarious screen grabs that we see come out of that. And then honestly, just watching him on the podium holding that trophy and getting so excited and so happy and almost this moment of relief that you see on his face, absolutely gorgeous. And then one of the most heartwarming moments, Sauber didn't have any champagne in inventory to celebrate after this race. And so we saw Mercedes actually bag up a ton of champagne from their inventory and send it over. And this is a moment of true sportsmanship, I think. We also watched so many drivers and team principals asked about this, and everyone was so respectful of it. Everyone was so happy for him. And I think there are moments like this where it is so big, it's so beyond competition, that it's something that everyone should want to celebrate. And it's something that they did celebrate. Obviously, also, Lando Norris wins his home Grand Prix, and this is a big deal. He's taking home a number of the milestone Grand Prix this year. He took home Monaco and now his home race. And also, we get some unique trophies here. These trophies were actually made out of Lego. And that's something that I do want to talk about in the post-race here. Post-race, a couple of things to point out. Obviously, everyone is celebrating Nico Hulkenberg and so thrilled. Lando Norris moments in the post-race press conference obviously is happy about this win, but also he does give Oscar his due for a good race run. And he also does say that he needs to see this kind of be consistent. 2 races back-to-back don't mean anything if you don't continue to win. On the flip side, we see Oscar very emotional and very disappointed in this race and kind of pointing everything to the penalty, consistently saying that he deserved a different outcome. And I think one thing that did rub people the wrong way a little bit was that in this post-race press conference, we do see him make this kind of joke towards Nico. And I think the issue with it, because I do think it was intended to be a humorous situation, was that it was done when he was being asked a question that he didn't want to be asked, and he kind of releases this other question to deflect. And he asks Nico how it feels to have waited so long for a podium and for the trophy to be made out of Lego that he could take apart and probably buy tomorrow, meaning like a new set of this is going to come out tomorrow, and he could have just purchased it from Lego. Nico kind of laughs it off and does say that he loves Lego and also that his daughter can play with it too. And I think it is kind of being blown up because I think there's a lot going on with the way Oscar reacted to everything. The same way that things are kind of blown up after Lando reacts to things, or Lewis or Charles Leclerc. Every driver is going to get over criticized when they're in a situation where they're a bit vulnerable. But I do think it was kind of maybe not received as a humorous situation by most people. And it felt like there could have been a little bit more celebration and niceness when it came to Nico's win, especially because so much of it got overshadowed by this penalty. Overall, that kind of closes out the race recap itself. Lando Norris wins the British Grand Prix. Nico Hulkenberg takes home an incredible 3rd place finish. Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes both break very long streaks of being successful at Silverstone, and our WDC race closes down to an 8-point gap. So that covers the race recap. Let's get into your questions and your hot takes and predictions for next race. Okay, first question. Is McLaren favoring Lando if they don't contest the 10-second penalty on Oscar? If it's not 1-2, they fight it. I think this is a semi-fair question, right? And I think the point of this has been kind of discussed online as well as in the post-race show. The idea being that if someone else had won the race, not Lando, that McLaren would have contested the penalty or lodged a protest after the race. I don't know that I would say that this is favoring Lando. I think it's just favoring your own interests. I think, frankly, from the data, McLaren probably knew that this was going to be ruled a penalty either way. Contesting it, obviously, if Lando had not won, probably would have happened just because there's no penalty for contesting something like this. But when it's your own driver that wins the race and you contest over the other driver getting a penalty for something that objectively you could say was a penalty, Zach actually kind of talks about this after when he was being interviewed by F1 TV, not about contesting it, but about the penalty itself, saying that he does think it was harsh, but he doesn't ever really say that he doesn't think it shouldn't have been a penalty. It's a tough one, obviously, but I do think that we're hearing a lot about the fact that other people were backed up, that there was a possibility of other people crashing. I think this would have been a penalty either way. And I think when one of your drivers wins a race due to a mistake of your other driver, contesting in favor of the driver who didn't win the race, potentially trying to take a race win away from one of your other drivers, I think that actually looks far more like you're favoring a driver over the other than simply leaving it alone. What do you think about Max and toes that he's gotten from Gabby and Kimi in qualifying? This is actually very funny because Kimi actually did give Max a toe during qualifying. I forgot to point this out, so I'm so glad someone asked. Max actually says post-qualifying that he got a toe from Kimi, and I honestly just thought it was so funny considering all of the drama going around Max possibly being Kimi's teammate, this conversation about George, and also given the fact that Max doesn't react poorly in Austria when Kimi takes him out of the race. It almost feels like a quid pro quo, like, okay, yes, I messed up your race last week, but let me give you a little toe and you can have pole and now we're all good. I think timing-wise, it was just hilarious given everything that's been going on. What do you think about the Piastri and Verstappen incident? I think I've covered this a ton throughout this whole race recap, so I'm not gonna harp on it anymore. Ultimately, I think it was a penalty that was deserved. I think it could have been a 5-second penalty over a 10-second penalty, depending, but I also do think it was a slightly dangerous situation. I think there are a lot of other factors that people are going to look at, as in when the safety car was called in, whether or not it was fair timing, how the braking looked through other parts of the track. But personally, I get why I think they called the penalty. What do you think Zach will do to celebrate? Another tattoo, maybe? This is actually very funny. If you don't know the lore, Zach Brown does have victory tattoos. And you know what? It would be kind of funny to see the only American team principal get a Silverstone tattoo 4th of July weekend to celebrate his British driver winning his home race. Why did Ferrari choose soft tires? This is a great question that honestly, it's hard to know what their tire strategy was this weekend. Things were so tough with the rain. Also, that soft tire was actually a compound softer than they're used to. I think everybody was just trying to figure out how to make the best possible solution out of their race. And honestly, because of how much was going on and the rain affecting everyone's strategy, I'm not sure anyone was sticking to their original strategy anyway. Could Oscar have stayed out and served the penalty post-race, or is it required to serve when he pits? So if he hadn't served the penalty during the race, basically when you go in for a pit stop, you do have to serve that penalty, which means that the crew can't physically touch the car until that 10 seconds are up, and then they can proceed with their pit stop. If he hadn't served the penalty, they still would have added the penalty on at the end of the race, and so there wouldn't have really been any benefit there for him. He actually would have ended up losing the race by a larger margin. And I also kind of think it's relevant to point out in this conversation that because of that 10-second penalty, we also heard Lando's pit stop strategy get changed a little bit because they couldn't double stack those cars, and they did decide to bring Oscar in first, which means that Lando ends up waiting behind and ends up having a pretty kind of rough pit stop as well. Not horrible, but certainly not a good pit stop. And so it did seem to affect Lando's race just a touch. How do you feel about Lewis's streak breaking? I have to be honest, I am sad that he didn't make that podium, but I will be also honest, I feel like with the way the McLarens were performing, there was no chance of anyone really taking 1 or 2 unless one of them had crashed out. And with that, it felt like there was only one other podium position up for grabs, and that ultimately goes to Nico Hulkenberg, and it's this big emotional thing. And I actually think it's kind of nice because last season we have Lewis Hamilton have this win, and it's this big emotional magic making moment. And then a year later, we have this big emotional history making moment for Nico. And I think it's kind of fun for this track to have that magic kind of pass to the next person. And I think as much as it would have meant to Lewis, I think it means more to Nico. And I found myself kind of tense and excited for him the entire way through. So from a history and legend status standpoint, it sucks for Lewis to kind of end that run with Silverstone, but hopefully there will be another Silverstone next year and we can always see a new change. And I don't know how many more chances Nico's going to have at a podium. Okay, why did Oscar slow down after the safety car was over? As I'm reading this question, I'm realizing I talked a lot about what happened here and the kind of numbers of it all, but not necessarily why he would have been slowing down. There are a couple of different things, and essentially what he was saying was that he was trying to get heat back into the tires and the brakes for the restart. So by kind of accelerating and decelerating, you're getting that heat back into the tires so that you can have a good advantage when you do restart and you have that grip. There's also the fact that when you are controlling that restart, you're going to try to catch the people behind you out, especially given the fact that Oscar had such a large gap already built that he felt like he then lost because the safety car neutralized it. So part of that move is for Oscar to try to keep an advantage over Max and Lando and to catch them off guard for when he does restart the race. It's just unfortunate that the timing and the conditions made this a little bit more dangerous and not necessarily a good move. And had he timed it a little bit differently, you would have had a different situation. I think the flip side of this is going to be a big argument about whether or not the safety car should have been called in when it was called and whether the FIA was at fault there. Regardless, it kind of doesn't matter because the safety car was called in, and so you have to go based off of that. Did having a huge grandstand help or hurt Lando despite the outcome? This is actually a fair question. I think there was a lot of conversation about this. Like, is there too much pressure for Lando to actually win this race? I think that type of thing can be different for each driver, but I think in this, it did seem to help. Lando did seem to be pretty excited. And also there's something really exciting about the visual of it. To be able to see how much this driver has built a fan base and also how much care he put into this Lando stand. Obviously his team was a big part of it, but you have the visual full of the blob wrapped kind of grandstand here. You also had an area for them all to hang out and also like food specifically for that Lando stand area. You also had hats and t-shirts included with those seats. As someone who sat in the Carlos grandstand in Barcelona, I was pretty jealous of the Lando stand vibes. I loved the Carlos grandstand. I've made videos about it. I thought it was so worth the money. And then watching the Lando stand, I was like, ooh, I want to be there too. I want to be in a driver grandstand all the time so badly. So I think the energy is positive for him. I think sometimes being able to see the fact that he sold out all of his merch before race day and they actually closed the shop up. Generally speaking, it seemed like a really big success, and what a win for him to be able to do so in front of his own grandstand for the first time. Moving on to hot takes and predictions. Someone says this is Oscar's villain origin arc, which is very funny. And then kind of related, we've got level-headed Oscar is gone, knives out until he has WDC, and Lando takes the championship lead next race. I think across the board, what's going to be most interesting is the same way we were talking about after Canada, just in reverse. Which of these drivers can come back after this type of situation and maintain their own momentum? Can Lando come back and maintain a third race win back-to-back? Can Oscar shake this off and drive unemotionally on track, or will he continue to drive angry? Will he take risks that end up paying off or not paying off? I think all of that is going to be really interesting to see because I think it shows you more of the mentality of a driver. One of the things I've said about Oscar before is it's always hard to tell where he's at in terms of his ranking for me because we didn't watch him go through the adversity of being at a lower team or having a low performing car. Oscar kind of came in right at the top with McLaren right before they really blew up. And so we haven't seen how he proves himself in the middle of the grid because he hasn't had to. This is still obviously not the middle of the grid, but the question is, how does he prove himself when his teammate has better luck, when he feels like he had something that wronged him? Can he recover, or does he get lost in his head in the same way that Lando's been criticized for? I think this will be something that will be interesting to watch in the next half of the season. We've got another hot take. This is not the last Hulk podium of this year. Look, I would love to see that. I think one of the things that is kind of cool is to look at the forward motion of Sauber. We've talked about this 2 weeks in a row now. They're now moving forward in the constructors standings in a way that Williams needs to be worried about, actually. If their performance can continue to improve, if we can continue to see points finishes, this would be a pretty big deal. Obsessed with stake team principal looking close to tears during their podium celebration. Girl, me too. Cold take, Lewis should have gotten a podium. I think I've talked about this one. It's hard. I someone who cried watching him win Silverstone in person last year. I also think it's hard because the person who did get this podium is so deserving and like emotionally overwhelmed by this. So it's hard. Maybe it is a cold take. We've got another Hulkenberg to Red Bull, which is very fun. And I think he's going to stick with Audi given the fact that they wanted a German driver there. And that I think potentially that could be a better team that's turning around for them. But God, can you imagine Max Verstappen to Mercedes and then Nico Hulkenberg to Red Bull? I don't know where George goes in that scenario, but things are heating up. And then also we've got one of my favorite predictions for the next race. Williams podium, Yuki points. I would probably take that over anything, actually. In terms of predictions, we have no races for the next 2 weeks. And I am excited to see what everybody comes back with. I think you're going to have a really strong second half of the year from Lando and Oscar. And I think watching them battle it out is going to be probably one of the most interesting races that we've seen in a long time. They are very comfortably in the front of constructors, and they're opening up that gap to the next person, which is Max for the driver's title. And they're closing the gap between the two of them. Both of them have now been criticized for their reactions to things happening and adversity on track. And both of them need to come back and really focus and show which one of them can maintain this mentally and strategically. I'm pretty interested to see how this actually pans out, but I'm going to give Lando a third race win back-to-back, or at least a win over Oscar, closing that championship gap a little bit more. I also think Oscar's going to come out strong, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that performs. I'm curious to see what he looks like when he's driving angry and whether or not that's a good thing. And next week, even though we don't have a race to recap, we are going to have our second quarterly report card for the drivers and the teammate standings. We're doing these every 6 races this season since we have 24 races this year, and we'll do teammate head-to-heads comparing them to the last episode that we did after race 6, and we'll also do a rookie report, seeing who's standing out the most amongst this rookie class. If there's any relevant F1 headlines, we'll also go through those next week. If you have any questions about the head-to-head or about this race or about the implications of it that you'd like me to answer in next week's episode, you can leave those in the comments of the YouTube version of this episode, or you can find me on all social media, including Instagram, TikTok, Tumblr, Facebook, Snapchat, Threads, wherever you get your internet. You can find me at Marissa Kamari. And of course, make sure you sign up for the Grid Chat Discord server. We watch the races together, share headlines, memes, and all of that fun stuff. And of course, I always open it up for questions that you may have after the race or throughout the season. All of the links to those are in the episode description, and I'll see you next week to do our quarterly F1 report card.